The political earthquake that just hit Westminster has left Keir Starmer staring into the abyss. What started as whispers in the corridors of power has now exploded into a full-blown crisis that threatens to reshape British politics forever. This isn't just another bad poll or minor scandal. This is the kind of seismic shift that political careers don't survive. The numbers are absolutely devastating. When the latest polling data landed on desks across Whitehall this morning, the silence was deafening. Labour insiders, who had spent months dismissing their rivals as fringe movements, suddenly found themselves facing an impossible reality. The ground beneath their feet had shifted so dramatically that everything they thought they knew about British politics had been turned upside down. For months, senior Labour figures had been briefing journalists that their opponents were nothing more than a temporary protest vote. They spoke with confidence about their inevitable march to Downing Street, convinced that the British public would eventually see sense and rally behind their vision. But politics has a cruel way of humbling those who become too comfortable with their assumptions. The warning signs had been there for anyone willing to look. Across working-class communities that Labour once considered their heartland, conversations in pubs and community centres had been shifting. People who had voted Labour for generations were expressing frustration with what they saw as a party that no longer understood their concerns. But the Westminster bubble is notorious for filtering out inconvenient truths, and Labour's leadership seemed genuinely shocked when reality finally caught up with them. What makes this political earthquake even more significant is its timing. This isn't happening during some distant future campaign season when political fortunes might naturally ebb and flow. This is happening right now, when Labour should be consolidating their position and preparing for government. Instead, they're watching their carefully constructed narrative crumble in real time. The human cost of this political drama cannot be overlooked. Behind every percentage point in these polls are real people making real decisions about their future. Families struggling with rising costs who feel abandoned by traditional politics. Workers concerned about job security who see their communities changing beyond recognition. Young people worried about housing and opportunities who believe the establishment has failed them. These aren't abstract political concepts. They're the lived experiences of millions of British citizens who have concluded that the old ways of doing politics simply aren't working anymore. And when people lose faith in the system, they start looking for alternatives, even if those alternatives would have seemed unthinkable just a few years ago. The psychological impact on Labour's leadership team must be immense. Imagine spending years building what you believed was a winning strategy, only to discover that the foundation was built on quicksand. Senior figures who had been making plans for ministerial positions are now facing the possibility that their political careers might be over before they've properly begun. But before we dive deeper into this unfolding drama, if you're finding this analysis helpful, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really helps us continue bringing you the kind of in-depth political coverage that you won't find anywhere else. Now, let's examine exactly how this nightmare scenario became reality. The emergence of Reform UK as a genuine political force represents more than just a shift in polling numbers. It represents a fundamental realignment of British politics that challenges everything we thought we knew about how elections work in this country. For decades, British politics operated on the assumption that voters would ultimately choose between two main options, with smaller parties playing supporting roles at best. That assumption has now been shattered completely. When Reform UK surged to 34% in the polls, they didn't just overtake Labour and the Conservatives, they obliterated them. This isn't a narrow lead that could be explained away by margin of error or temporary fluctuations. This is a commanding position that suggests something profound has changed in the British political landscape. The electoral mathematics are truly staggering. When these polling numbers are fed through prediction models, they produce results that would have been considered science fiction just months ago. Reform UK winning a parliamentary majority with 264 seats, the Liberal Democrats becoming the official opposition, Labour reduced to just 44 seats and relegated to third place, behind parties they had previously dismissed as irrelevant. Think about what this would mean in practical terms. Nigel Farage walking through the famous black door of number 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister. Cabinet meetings, where traditional Conservative and Labour voices are completely absent. A House of Commons where the old certainties of British politics have been swept away entirely. Even more shocking is the human toll this political earthquake would exact on individual careers. High-profile politicians who had spent years climbing the greasy pole of Westminster politics would find themselves without seats entirely. Current cabinet ministers, shadow cabinet members, and party leaders all wiped out in a single election night. It's the kind of wholesale clearance of the political class that Britain has never experienced in modern times. The response from the political establishment has been predictably dismissive. Senior figures from both Labour and Conservative parties have rushed to explain why these numbers don't really matter, why they're just a temporary blip, why voters will come to their senses when faced with a real choice. But this response reveals how fundamentally out of touch they've become with public sentiment. The truth is that momentum in politics is everything. Once voters begin to see an alternative as viable, that perception becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. People who might have stayed loyal to traditional parties despite their reservations suddenly feel permission to vote for something different. And once that dam breaks, the flood can be impossible to contain. What's particularly damaging for Labour is how this development undermines their core campaign message. For months, they've been positioning themselves as the only realistic alternative to Conservative rule. Their entire strategy has been built around the idea that voters faced a simple choice between more of the same or genuine change under Labour leadership. But if Reform UK is genuinely surging ahead in the polls, that narrative collapses entirely. Suddenly, Labour isn't the change candidate anymore. They're just another establishment party fighting for relevance in a political landscape that has moved beyond them. It's a devastating blow to their credibility that no amount of spin can fully repair. The regional breakdown of these numbers tells an even more interesting story. Reform UK's support isn't concentrated in traditional political strongholds or among predictable demographic groups. Instead, it appears to be drawing support from across the country and across different communities. This suggests that their appeal isn't based on narrow geographic or cultural factors, but on broader dissatisfaction with how British politics currently operates. This broad-based support makes Reform UK's rise much more difficult for traditional parties to counter. If their appeal were limited to specific regions or demographics, Labour and the Conservatives could develop targeted strategies to win those voters back. But when the discontent is this widespread, it suggests that the problems run much deeper than any individual policy position or campaign message can address. The international implications of this political earthquake cannot be ignored either. Britain's allies and partners around the world have been watching British politics with growing concern as traditional certainties have begun to crumble. A Reform UK government would represent a dramatic shift in Britain's approach to international relations, trade policy, and global cooperation. Financial markets, too, are beginning to take notice of these political developments. Currency traders and investors who had been pricing in certain assumptions about Britain's political future are now having to recalculate their positions. The pound's recent volatility reflects not just economic concerns, but genuine uncertainty about what kind of government Britain might have after the next election. For Keir Starmer personally, this represents the worst possible nightmare. He spent years positioning himself as the sensible, electable face of modern Labour. His entire political identity has been built around the idea that he could unite the party and lead it back to power after years in opposition. But these polling numbers suggest that his carefully crafted image of competent leadership might be completely irrelevant if voters have already decided to look elsewhere. The psychological pressure on any political leader facing numbers like these must be enormous. Every public appearance becomes an exercise in projecting confidence while privately wondering whether your political career is already over. Every policy announcement gets overshadowed by questions about whether you'll even be around long enough to implement it. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this political earthquake isn't what it says about Reform UK's rise or Labour's decline. It's what it reveals about the complete breakdown of trust between the British people and their traditional political institutions. When voters are willing to embrace such dramatic change, it suggests that they've lost faith in the entire system's ability to address their concerns. This isn't just about disagreement over specific policies or dissatisfaction with particular leaders. This represents a fundamental crisis of legitimacy that goes to the heart of how democracy functions in Britain. When significant portions of the electorate conclude that none of the traditional options are worth supporting, it creates dangerous instability that can have consequences far beyond any single election. The media response to these developments has been fascinating to observe. Journalists who had spent months analysing the nuances of Labour and Conservative policy positions suddenly find themselves scrambling to understand a political force they had largely ignored. Opinion writers, who had confidently predicted the next election's outcome, are now admitting they might have completely misread the public mood. This disconnect between media coverage and political reality highlights another aspect of the crisis facing British democracy. When the institutions responsible for informing public debate are themselves caught off guard by major political developments, it suggests that the entire system for understanding and responding to voter concerns has broken down. The timing of this political earthquake makes it even more significant. Britain is facing enormous challenges across multiple fronts. Economic pressures, social tensions, international complications, and institutional challenges all require strong, stable leadership. But instead of providing that leadership, the political system appears to be fragmenting just when the country needs it most. Young voters, in particular, seem to be driving much of this political realignment. Traditional party loyalties that might have kept their parents and grandparents voting the same way for decades simply don't exist for many people in their 20s and 30s. They're approaching political choices as consumers, looking for options that best serve their interests rather than inheriting partisan identities. This generational shift in political behaviour has profound implications for how campaigns are run and how parties build long-term support. The old model of relying on tribal loyalty and traditional media coverage is clearly no longer sufficient. Parties that fail to adapt to this new reality will continue to lose ground to those that better understand how to connect with modern voters. The economic implications of this political earthquake extend far beyond immediate market reactions. Business leaders who had been making investment decisions based on certain assumptions about Britain's political future now face genuine uncertainty about what policies they might need to navigate. This uncertainty itself becomes a drag on economic growth and job creation. International trade relationships, too, could be fundamentally altered depending on how this political realignment plays out. Britain's position within global supply chains, its approach to regulatory alignment with European neighbours, and its participation in international institutions could all change dramatically under different political leadership. The constitutional implications are equally significant. A reform UK government would likely approach questions of parliamentary sovereignty, judicial independence, and administrative efficiency very differently than traditional parties. This could lead to substantial changes in how Britain is governed, not just what policies it pursues. Local communities across Britain are already beginning to feel the effects of this political earthquake. Council elections, mayoral contests, and other local races are seeing unprecedented volatility as voters experiment with different options. This grassroots political upheaval often presages larger national changes, suggesting that what we're seeing in national polls reflects deeper shifts in political behaviour. The role of social media in amplifying and accelerating these political changes cannot be overlooked. Traditional gatekeepers who might once have been able to control the pace of political change find themselves unable to manage information flows that bypass established channels entirely. Voters are forming opinions and making decisions based on sources and influences that existing political institutions struggle to understand or counter. This represents a fundamental challenge to how political campaigns have traditionally operated. The old model of controlling message through established media channels and relying on party machinery to turn out reliable voters simply doesn't work when significant portions of the electorate are getting their information and forming their opinions through entirely different mechanisms. The psychological impact on traditional party activists and volunteers must be devastating. People who have spent years or even decades working for Labour or Conservative campaigns suddenly find themselves questioning whether their efforts have been wasted. The social networks and personal relationships built around political activism are being strained as long-held assumptions about political reality prove incorrect. This human cost of political upheaval often gets overlooked in analysis, focused on polling numbers and electoral calculations. But the personal devastation experienced by people whose political worldview has been shattered has real consequences for how democratic institutions function and recover. As we look toward the future, the question isn't really whether this political earthquake will continue to reshape British politics. The question is how far the changes will go, and whether traditional institutions will be able to adapt quickly enough to maintain their relevance. The forces that have produced this moment seem unlikely to simply disappear, regardless of how any individual election turns out. The challenge for British democracy is finding ways to channel this obvious appetite for change into constructive outcomes that actually address the underlying concerns driving voter behaviour. If traditional institutions prove incapable of this adaptation, the political earthquake we're witnessing today may be just the beginning of even more dramatic changes to come. For Keir Starmer and Labour, the hard news continues to get worse with each passing day. What was supposed to be their moment of triumph has become a nightmare scenario that threatens not just their immediate electoral prospects, but their long-term viability as a major political force. The question now is whether they can find ways to respond to this crisis that go beyond hoping the numbers will somehow improve on their own. The British people have spoken through these polling numbers, and their message is clear. They want fundamental change, not incremental adjustments to a system they believe has failed them. Political leaders who understand this message and find ways to respond to it constructively will prosper. Those who don't will find themselves consigned to the dustbin of political history.